Now I'd like to introduce our presenter for today's webinar, Shannon Studden. Shannon joined the center as a program specialist coming to us from the University of Minnesota Duluth in February. I'll give Shannon the opportunity to share more about herself with all of you within the next few minutes. Thank you for joining us, Shannon, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kiona. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. As Kiona said, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself in a minute, but first I want to give you a little bit of background about why we're talking about collaboration and engagement today. A quick note about RHI. As your TA provider, we work in partnership with the National Rural Health Resource Center to connect rural health organizations with innovations that enhance the health of rural communities. So, last September, RHI held a Rural Health Network Summit in Minneapolis, where network leaders came together to share their thoughts about the role of network leaders in the changing healthcare landscape. And the findings from this summit were shared in a webinar led by Cap Wilkes in our office this past February. Part of what came out of that summit was the list you see here. This is a list of the 6 common roles of networks. This list represents a consensus from the summit attendees. So it shows what you and your peers say are the most important roles that networks play. If you attended the summit or if you participated in the webinar, this list may look familiar to you. It includes serving in a leadership capacity, facilitating continuous planning, identifying and providing meaningful education, collecting resources, collecting, analyzing, and acting on data, and convening and engaging stakeholders. And as discussions unfolded at the summit, it became clear that a critical skill for network leaders is the ability to drive collaboration and engagement. And that's why this topic was chosen as the focus for this webinar. If you take a look at this list, it's kind of hard to find anything that network leaders do all by themselves. That's really the nature of a network, right? So while the last role, convening and engaging stakeholders, is a category all by itself, it's clear when you look at this list that engagement is important to many of the other roles that were identified as well. All these roles require collaboration in some form, and as you all know, in order to collaborate, you need engaged co-collaborators. So when we drill down a little bit deeper into the topic of convening and engaging stakeholders at this summit, we asked about key actions that network leaders can take and resources that would help network leaders to engage their stakeholders. This slide shows some of the common themes that came from the group. And if you take a minute to look at it, you'll see things like building trust, transparency about mission and vision, a process to identify what's in it for me. And these are the kinds of things we'll be looking at today when you think about working inside your network group. But really, these are just as relevant when you're working outside your network as well. A lot of these really serve as the foundation for marketing and messaging externally. So our next 2 webinars in June and August focus on marketing externally, and we'll be coming back to some similar themes throughout these sessions. So by the end of the year, you'll have a lot of tools in your toolbox for communicating and working both internally and externally to your network. Before we get too far into the topic for today, let me just take a minute to introduce myself as a new member of the RHI team. Again, my name is Shannon Studden, and I'm a program specialist with the network development team. I came to the center from the Continuing Education Department at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where I created leadership development and continuous improvement programs for organizations in Minnesota and Wisconsin across a variety of industries, including healthcare. Before that, I spent several years managing the leadership development and talent management programs for Cleveland-Cliffs, which is a global iron mining company, and also serving as a faculty member in the School of Business and Economics at the University of Minnesota Duluth. My educational background is in the field of industrial organizational psychology, which takes concepts from the field of psychology like group dynamics, interpersonal relationships, conflict resolution, systems theory, and applies it to the workplace. A particular interest of mine is the topic of influence without authority. So kind of how people are able to get other people on board with their ideas when they don't have formal authority giving them the power to direct the activities of others. We all know people who are really influential as well as those who aren't, and I've spent a lot of time looking at this. So I've done research, I've spent a lot of time talking to formal and informal leaders and facilitating discussions about what makes people successful as informal leaders. This is really what you are tasked with as network leaders, and this is one of the many reasons I'm really excited to be part of the team here at RHI and to help support the work that you all do. Okay, so back to the topic at hand. Here are the learning objectives for today's webinar. When I think about objectives, even though I am a learning and development professional, my eyes kind of tend to glaze over when I look at objectives. So I like to think about them instead as questions that we'll answer, and so this is a set of our set of objectives in a slightly different format. So flipping these objectives around a little bit, here are the questions we'll answer today. What promotes engagement and what gets in the way? How can I figure out what's important to my stakeholders and what can I do to tap into what's important to them? And what can I do before and during meetings to encourage engagement in the moment? So we'll start with kind of a broad view and then we'll narrow it down as we go. We'll touch on a lot of topics, and as with any webinar, some of these topics will be most likely more relevant for you than others. Some suggestions won't work in your specific situation, but some might. And so as we go, I just encourage you to pay attention to what resonates most with you and think about your nugget for the day or your biggest takeaway. So let's start by agreeing on a few definitions, since all of these terms can mean slightly different things to different people. When we talk about collaboration, we're talking about working together to achieve a common goal. For the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to consider stakeholders, which can mean a lot of different things. But for today, we're going to consider stakeholders to be anyone who is actively participating in the work of the network. This could be your board, network members, partners, or anyone else who contributes to the work that the network does. When we talk about people who are engaged, we mean people who are committed to the network's goals and who are willing to engage in activities that help achieve these goals. With engagement being the focus of today's webinar, let's dig a little bit deeper into what exactly engagement looks like. It's one of those things where we kind of know it when we see it, but it's hard to put our finger on defining it. It's really important to clearly operationalize it so that you know what to look for when you're making judgment calls about how engaged your stakeholders are or are not. Aon Hewitt is a global management consulting firm, and they have a really good operational definition of engagement, and it consists of three pieces: say, stay, and strive. When people are engaged, they say things, so they speak positively about the network, they advocate for the network out in the community. They also stay, they come to meetings, they continue to participate in meetings after the initial launch is over. And last, they strive. They put forth effort. They speak up in meetings, they propose ideas, they volunteer to do things, and they follow through on what they say they're going to do. So I'm going to pull up our first poll. If you think about this definition of engagement as being how much people say, stay, and strive, what proportion of your stakeholders would you say is fully engaged in the work of your network? So just take a minute, think about that a little bit. Select your answer and we'll see what the group has to say. Oh boy, we started off with a lot of engagement and we seem to be going down as time goes on. Okay, so it looks like we've got the biggest group of respondents saying 60 to 80% of stakeholders, which actually isn't a terrible place to be. Some of you feel that you've got a really good set of engaged stakeholders. That's great to see. And it looks like we've got some who are farther down the scale. So here's what I have to say about that. First of all, we will, the purpose of this webinar is to give you some tools and some tips. And so if you're really feeling like you don't have the engagement that you'd like to have, again, just pay attention to the nuggets that are most relevant for you. And for those of you who feel like you really do have good engagement, we'd love to hear some of the things that have worked for you. So as we talk about these different topics related to engagement, if any ideas come up that you'd like to share with the group, we'd love to see that. So just enter that into the chat box kind of in the middle of the left side of your screen. Anything that you can share with the group is always helpful. It's great to hear from people who are in similar situations. Let me get this poll out of the way. Okay, so what's your role in engagement? As a network leader, I don't think I have to tell you that you've got a tough job. It's your role to pull together a diverse group of people with differing and sometimes competing priorities. You've got different personalities, different perspectives, and of course we've got egos. So it's your job to take all those differences and get people working toward a common goal. It's hard enough to do this when you're in a formal leadership role. So when you directly supervise a group and you've got formal power to assign responsibilities and hold people accountable when they don't meet expectations. But it's exceptionally difficult when you're in an informal leadership role where you need to be really good at influencing people without having that formal authority. So that's why not everybody does what you do, because it's hard. We're going to go over some strategies today for influencing people outside of a formal leadership relationship. But it's important to note that when you're dealing with people, things are never very straightforward, even if we are talking about a formal leadership role. If you've been on this earth for any length of time, you've learned that you can't control other people. What you can do, though, and this is something that can really only be done by you as a network leader, is to set up an environment that makes it more likely that people will feel and do what you're hoping they'll feel and do. So that's what we're going to give you a few tips on today, is that environment. Let's look at some foundational pieces. So what do we know about collaboration and engagement in groups? We know that effective collaboration is impossible without engaged group members. We know that when dealing with complex problems, groups do a much better job making decisions and solving problems than individuals do, because they bring different mindsets, different perspectives, different areas of expertise, and all of the other benefits that come from putting multiple heads together. We know from decades of research that the more engaged your stakeholders are, the more they'll say, stay, and strive. The higher the likelihood of success is for the network, meaning that you'll meet or even exceed your goals, you'll make fewer missteps along the way, and you'll build stronger relationships as you move forward. And interestingly enough, this lines up really well with what came out of last fall's Summit of Network Leaders. Participants said that when we do a good job of convening and engaging stakeholders, all of these benefits result. So all the things that you see on this slide. We've shared the workload of change, share issues that amplify the needs of members, and increases your political voice, your credibility, opportunities for funding, and everything else that's listed here. So it sounds like there's some consensus on what engagement gives us. Now the question is, how do we set up the environment to increase the likelihood that we'll get it. At the end of the set of slides, we've got a set of resources that we think might be helpful to those of you who want to more fully understand engagement or have specific engagement-related goals. And one of those resources is a book called Committed Teams by Mario Musa. In that book, the author clearly outlines what it takes to really get commitment from team members. And the things we're going to look at on the next few slides come from that book and from the decades of research that has been done into effective teams. So the foundations are two factors that really absolutely must be in place in order for any individual to be engaged in a group. One is for all group members to have a common understanding of the vision, the big why. What are we working toward? If there's a lack of clarity about what the group's trying to do, or there are different interpretations of what the group is trying to do, it's almost impossible for people to direct their efforts in the right direction. It's a little bit like shooting in the dark. It's also critical that each member of the group understands exactly why he or she is there. Why are they specifically in the room, and what expertise or perspective do they bring that nobody else can? And as a network leader, this is a central part of your role. And here I just caution you to be careful about your assumptions, because often when we're really immersed in something, we start to get the feeling that others know as much as we do about it, feel the same way we do about it, and we tend to think that we've communicated something a lot more than we actually have, because we are so immersed in it every day. And if you've got stakeholders that aren't staying, and striving as much as you'd like them to, this might be a good place to start. It might be a good thing to revisit this. So do your stakeholders really understand the vision? And do they know specifically why they, in particular, have been asked to participate in working toward that vision? Whether they buy into the vision is a whole other question, which we'll talk about more in a couple minutes. So how do you do that? Here are some thoughts. Revisiting the vision can be as simple as having a group conversation with your stakeholders. You can ask questions like, so you get all your stakeholders together, and you can ask questions like, how does the vision describe what we want to become? Do we feel our goals and our activities are aligned with our mission and our vision? And then to get input from your stakeholders. So what contribution do each of us make to the achievement of this? And you can ask for stakeholders to share what they think about the contributions that their fellow stakeholders can make, or you can ask them about their own perspective. So remember what your role is in these conversations. You're looking to draw information out of your stakeholders so that you can clearly understand where they're coming from. This might very well mean that you do less talking than anyone else in the room. When at the All Programs meeting in Maryland in February, Mary Kay Chess said something related to this that I thought was really important. She said something along the lines of, it was much more eloquent than this, but it was something along the lines of, don't listen for the answer you're looking for. Listen for what others are really trying to tell you, because it could take you in a completely different direction than you initially set out on. And it might very well be a much better direction. So if you really listen, the responses you hear from the group will give you a good sense of how much consensus there is. And it'll give you and other stakeholders the opportunity to answer questions, provide clarity, make sure that everyone does have a common understanding of the goals of the group, and a feeling that their role in making it happen is very clearly defined. This can be a really valuable conversation to have. Even if you feel like you're already down the road, it's always a good idea to periodically come back and just revisit these questions to make sure that everybody's still on the same page. So it's critical for stakeholders to have a clear, shared understanding of what the group is working toward and what they're there to contribute. So those two factors have to be in place, but by themselves they don't guarantee engagement. There's more to it. In order to really be engaged in any group, people need to feel that their values and the group values are in sync, and that other group members value their contribution. So before, when I said we'll talk about whether your stakeholders really buy into the mission and vision, this is where we start to get into that. So think back to when you're in school and you had to do a group project, the dreaded group project. When those were bad, they were really bad. And you can probably trace it back to at least one of these two factors. If you value quality in the end product of your group project, and you had fellow group members who didn't value quality as much as you did, you probably felt less engaged in the group. Or if your suggestions were often ignored, you probably felt less valued by the group. And as a result, you put in less effort. So it comes back again to that whole say, stay, and strive thing again. To get at these additional factors of aligning the values of the individual stakeholder with the values of the group, you can ask questions like this. You can add questions to a meeting. You can have a separate conversation about it, but when you sit down with your stakeholders and have a discussion around this topic, you can ask questions like, so when you're revisiting your mission and your vision, what about the mission and vision resonates with you? What pieces of this are really important to you personally? What aspects of the vision are meaningful or exciting to you? How do the mission and the vision overlap with your goals? So getting at, again, helping people tap into what's important to them through the work of the network. And it also gives you a lot of insight as the network leader as to what's personally important to each of your stakeholders. So we're going to look at two tools for doing this to really help making some explicit connections between what's important to your stakeholders and what the goals are of the network. We'll look at two tools for that right now. So we're going to get into stakeholder analysis. There are a lot of versions of stakeholder analysis out there. I would love to have been able to show you the definitive way to do it, but the best method is really dependent upon the context. So what I'm going to do is show you two stakeholder analysis tools that I've used in situations that are similar to a network, where one person is trying to get buy-in and some action from people that they don't have formal control over or formal influence over. And if what I'm sharing with you today doesn't quite fit your situation, feel free to modify it in any way that does get you what you need, or do a search and pull some other resources that are better fit to your context. The purpose of these tools is to help you clarify the connection between what's important to each of your stakeholders, every single one, and what the goals are of the network. This can help your own thought processes, and it can also help you as you plan your work and plan your communication with stakeholders. Stakeholder analysis, I will tell you, does require some time and energy, but it can really pay off in the long run. If you are currently feeling like all of your stakeholders really already get this connection, but you're not getting the engagement you'd like, again, I would just caution you to check your assumptions. Because again, when we're immersed in something and we work on something every day, and as a result, things are really clear to us, we often assume that others have the same level of understanding we do. Just keep in mind that the network might be something you think about and something you work on every day. But for some of your stakeholders, this is one piece in their work life, and they may need a little bit more help connecting the dots. Okay, so one tool that's commonly used in stakeholder analysis is a stakeholder map. A stakeholder map helps you put together a complete picture of your entire population of stakeholders. And it takes into account their potential influence on the project, their ability to as you can see in the vertical axis, influence on project, and the impact of the project on them individually. You can see that on the horizontal axis, and their current attitude about the network. It's important to know that this is a tool for you to work through on your own or with a trusted ally. This is generally not something that you're going to want to share with your whole stakeholder group, but this is really for you to give you the foundation to work from. It can help you identify priorities and strategies for addressing stakeholder engagement. So the process works like this. You identify each of your stakeholders and determine whether they have a low, medium, or high influence on the project, so that's your vertical axis, and whether the project will have a low, medium, or high impact on them, so that's the horizontal axis. And then you actually plot each stakeholder on the map using a shape that corresponds with your estimate, anyway, of their attitude toward the work of the network. Are they an enthusiast? Are they kind of neutral? Are they an opponent? Let's look at an example. So this is a really simplistic example of what a stakeholder map could look like. This is what I used. I pulled a really small hypothetical network just for simplicity's sake. You can see that if you look in the upper left-hand corner that Joe has strong influence over what the network does. He isn't very strongly impacted by the work of the network because he is in the low box on the horizontal axis. And he's been classified as fairly neutral. He's got a yellow square. Kim's high on both dimensions. She's high on her influence on the project and the impact of the project on her, and she's seen as an enthusiast. And Eve's not too far off from Kim, but she's seen anyway as not being on board at all with the work of the network. Going through an exercise like this can be really eye-opening. It can help you identify your top priority stakeholder. And when I say top priority, I don't mean in the sense of being more valuable than others, but I assume that most of you have a limited number of hours in the day, and it can be helpful to be strategic about where you spend your time and energy. So you might have guessed that the top right corner shakes out to be your highest priority. The people who have a lot of influence and will be greatly impacted by the network are the ones you want to devote the most energy to. So in this example, if I were the leader of this network and I wanted to put some effort into increasing the engagement of my stakeholders, I would probably zero in on Eve as someone that I wanted to devote some time or energy on in the near future. However, I'd also want to be sure that I didn't lose sight of Kim because she could potentially be my biggest ally. I might also want to do a little bit of strategizing around Dan's engagement since he's still part of the top right quadrant. Again, this doesn't mean the other people aren't important. It's just a way for us to be strategic about where we spend the finite amount of time and energy we all have available to us. Sometimes when I've done this, people look at something like this and think, oh, really, do I really have to spend time analyzing people in such detail and putting a lot of effort into determining exactly who I need to spend time on and how I should be communicating with them? I've got two things for you to think about. One is that, yes, it can absolutely take what feels like a lot of effort to sort through all this, especially if you've got a large group of stakeholders. But the effort I have seen pay off multiple times in spades because there's all kinds of research showing that thinking through this and planning on the front end, or at least as early as possible, can save you an exponential amount of time on the back end. So trying to fix and clean up when you're really having trouble keeping your stakeholders engaged. The more time you spend on this on the front end, generally the more time multiplied it will save you on the back end. The other thing that I proposed to you is better news, and that's that you don't have to do all the heavy lifting alone. You're part of a network, so putting together a stakeholder map can also help you identify other people in that network who can be your allies and can help you influence their fellow stakeholders and their level of engagement. All right, so if you've decided you want to do a stakeholder map, then what's your next step? The next step is to dig in with some stakeholder analysis questions. And here, this is where you may want to pull a few other people into the conversation so you can get more than one perspective. And if you really want to go all in, you could even have this conversation with the stakeholder himself or herself. This is not something sinister we're doing here that needs to be kept under wraps. This is really sincere work with the end goal of ensuring that the relationship between the stakeholder and the broader network is mutually beneficial. So you decide what makes sense in your situation. But regardless of what you want to choose as far as getting other people involved, here are some of the questions that you could ask. So number one, what's important to this stakeholder? So in our case, we're talking about Eve. So what's important to Eve? What does the network need from her? How will the work of the network help her with what's important to her? How can I or other people, remember you're not in this alone, so can you get other people involved? How can I or others clearly communicate the connection between what the network does and what's important to her? And then on the flip side of that, how can I or other people modify what we're doing so that we can more fully connect the work of the network? So can we modify anything that we're doing to really tap into what's important to them? And how will I know I'm making progress? And this is a really specific question looking for really specific answers. What will you see to make you feel like you're making some progress, or what might you hear? If you've had conversations related to the foundations and the building blocks about the mission and vision we talked about earlier, it'll be a lot easier to answer these questions, even if you aren't having this particular conversation with the stakeholder himself or herself. So let's go through our example with Eve. This is again a really simplistic example. I kept this simple for illustration's sake. So let's imagine that Eve from our stakeholder map is the CEO of a hospital, part of our network. She hasn't been coming to meetings lately. She has sent a representative, which is nice, but the representative doesn't have any decision-making authority. So the representative she has sent has to defer a lot of decisions while he served as the go-between between the network and Eve. So going through these questions, here are some of the things you might find. So what's important to Eve? We know financial outcomes are important to Eve. She's responsible for financial outcomes for her facility. What does the network need from her? We need funding commitment. Participation in meetings would be nice too, but ultimately we need funding commitment. So if we think then about how the work of a network will help Eve with what is important to her, it may be that in the end we'll get her some increased reimbursement rates that would help her with her bottom line. How can we more clearly communicate the connection? Well, maybe we could have a really explicit conversation that would highlight a similar program and the results they got in reimbursements as an outcome of their project. And then flipping that around, are there things that we can do differently to bring her back into the fold, to get her more excited about what we're doing? And it might be prioritizing some of the things that are important to her. So in this case, is it possible that we could move the activities that are going to have a direct impact on reimbursements up earlier in our timeline? How will I know I'm making progress? Eve shows up at meetings tomorrow. It may be something else. Again, I know this is a really simplistic example, but thinking through this can give you some real insights. And again, if you bring other people into the conversation, it can give you even a broader perspective. And if you look at this, the answers to questions 4 and 5, so how can we clearly communicate the connection and how can we modify what we're doing, that then kind of serves as the basis for your plan going forward. So my next communication with Eve might include sharing the reimbursement-related outcomes that a similar network achieved, and also letting her know that because I know reimbursement's a priority for her, I'm wondering what she thinks about moving the network's planned activities that might directly impact reimbursements sooner in the timeline. One quick thought I want to share with you that's related to the concept of setting up the environment, which, as you recall, is really the best you can do as someone with informal influence, so that people are more likely to do and feel what you're hoping they'll do and feel. Working with people can really be frustrating. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that. And I know that I am sometimes guilty of attributing someone's unwillingness to get on board with my ideas as just them being difficult. But as Chip and Dan Heath are two brothers who have written a couple of really great books. One of them is called Switch, which is about how hard it is to change ourselves and get others to do things differently. But what they say is what looks like a people problem is often a situation problem. So very often when you can make adjustments to the situation, whether that happens by introducing new information or changing processes or broader goals to be more in line with the other person's priorities or whatever that is, the other person's behavior can change. So this doesn't mean that there aren't difficult people out there, just that if you go into a situation with a mindset that's focused on setting up the environment to maximize engagement in ways that are meaningful to your stakeholders, you'll make more progress and you'll keep yourself more engaged than if you start from a more defeatist kind of place, just with the mindset that the other person is just difficult and there's not a whole lot you can do. I know it's easier said than done, but it's always a good reminder. Okay, so let's again zero in a little bit closer. We've talked kind of broadly, and we're narrowing our focus down. Let's look at meetings. So I'm going to pull up another poll here. During a typical network-related meeting, how would you describe the level of participant engagements in discussions and activities during a meeting? Take a couple of minutes and select your answer. All right, so it looks like we've got, so far nobody has said everybody is fully engaged. We've got a big group who say most participants are fully engaged, and tapers off as we get farther down. Almost no meeting participants are fully engaged. Oh my gosh, hopefully by the end of this we will give you some tools that will help move the needle on that one. I suspect that some of this may result from maybe a little bit of an outcome of having people participate remotely, which is even a bigger challenge in getting engagement in meetings, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so again, if you've got a group that you feel like you've got some good engagement and you have ideas on things that have worked for you to get people engaged during meetings, please feel free to share those in the chat box on the side. I'm going to end this. I'm going to turn the poll off, get it out of the way. All right, so it looks like we've all got room for improvement. And again, we were dealing with people, so we're probably never going to get to 100% all the time. But again, this is about setting up the environment to maximize your odds of getting greater engagement. So let's take a look at meetings. We've looked at factors that promote and that get in the way of engagement, and we've talked about some strategies for connecting your approaches to the things that are important to your stakeholders. So now let's get down to where the rubber meets the road, which is the vehicle for making a lot of the things that we've been talking about actually happen, which is the meeting. We've all been part of meetings that were really effective and those that were the opposite of that. Again, because meetings involve people and you never have control over what people say or do. Your job is to set up the environment to make it as likely as possible that people will feel engaged in discussions. What we know about encouraging engagement in meetings isn't really very different from what we know about encouraging engagement in broader group activities. People are more engaged when they know the goals of the meeting and they know their contribution is valued. But because meetings are a really specific activity, we can get really specific about some strategies for setting up the environment for meetings in ways that facilitate engagement. So let's look at those. So we'll look at some strategies in order, things you can do before the meeting, things you can do during a meeting, and things you can do after a meeting to maximize the odds of engagement. According to Roger Schwartz, who is an organizational psychologist who specializes in influence and groups and leadership, and he is a frequent contributor to the Harvard Business Review, what he says is that one of the most common obstacles to engagement in meetings is a lack of a clear agenda, something as specific and concrete as an agenda. A good agenda includes a list of the topics to be discussed and the decisions to be made, the amount of time that will be allocated to each, and depending on the situation, a really well laid out agenda may also include the names of the people who lead certain parts of the meeting or will be asked for specific input. A best practice is to create a draft agenda and send it out to the group a few days ahead of time and ask for input. This gives stakeholders the opportunity to share in ownership of the meeting, which again promotes engagement. So most likely you won't get a lot of responses, but just the act of asking for input can all in itself help to promote a feeling of engagement in the group. And it also gives people some time ahead of time to think about what will be decided. They can gather information. They can think through their thoughts. When you're planning the topics to be discussed, be sure that you're thinking about what's important to meeting participants and tying those topics to be discussed back to those priorities. You'll find that I'm repeating this idea again and again as we go through this. So also be sure that you're allocating enough time to each topic, because if you find yourself trying to jam too much into the agenda, all you'll do is set yourself up for frustration. People will always be pleasantly surprised if you end early, but you've probably experienced some frustration if the meeting runs late or if you have to table a whole bunch of topics until the next meeting. Here's one example of a part of an agenda from a network board meeting. You can see it has the basics, the date, the time, the location, but then they've also included reminders of things they've agreed to as a group. There's a description of what happens when someone can't attend. You can see under participation when a member's designated board director cannot attend, what happens. And there's a set of ground rules. It outlines who's responsible for each agenda item. This is just a piece, so we can't see it all. But if you look at the bottom, you can see that the board president is slated to handle the call to order at 10. And then way down at the bottom is one example of a decision to be made. Looks like it's approving the board agenda. This is a pretty formal agenda, which may or may not be a perfect fit for your network, but I just show it as an example of an agenda that makes everything very clear to participants, including those who aren't able to attend. And again, if you've got people who are busy, you're going to have people who can't make every meeting. This is an agenda as a really important vehicle for keeping people in the loop. Here's another example of an agenda template that an organization I've consulted with in the past requires everyone in the organization to use. It's not very pretty, but it's very utilitarian, and it gets the job done for them. So where the other agenda had a lot of detail, this agenda gets right down to business. Here's a few differences that I want to point out. First, the meeting purpose. You can see that just before the first table. So what the expected outcome of this meeting is. They decided to include this because it really helps direct all of the conversations toward the expected outcome, both of the meeting overall and of each agenda item. If you've ever gotten halfway through a meeting and wondered, what are we trying to do here? You can see that this could actually be helpful sometimes. They also designate time allocated to each topic. You can see over on the left, there are 10 minutes allocated to the first couple topics and then 15 minutes for topic number 2. And they list the person responsible for leading that discussion. In this example over on the right, facilitator is all ML, the initials of the person leading the meeting, but those can vary depending on the meeting. You'll see that at the bottom of the agenda is an action item list. This is a major emphasis in this organization, always tying back to the expected outcomes of the meeting. So in every meeting, there's one person in the group responsible for filling in this list during the meeting as people volunteer or as people are assigned to do certain things. And then you can see that the very last item in that first table, 5 minutes is allocated to review and document all action items. So you can see that they even end their meeting by making sure everybody agrees on the action items. I show you these 2 examples of an agenda, not to say that one is better than another, but just to or that you should use either one of these, in this current format. But just to show you that there are a lot of different ways to create an agenda, and it's important to use a format that fits your group. It's a really valuable tool for ensuring that everyone has the same understanding of what's going to happen in a meeting, as well as what's going to happen as a result of that meeting. So let's look at what you can do during a meeting. Some simple things: start and end on time, which shows respect for people's time. Stick to the agenda within reason. So if something really important comes up that needs some extra time, absolutely make that call, but make it as a group so everyone can agree. Decide whether you agree it's important enough to modify the original plan, and that just may involve tabling some things until the next meeting. As the convener of the meeting, you're responsible for making sure that discussions are balanced and that everyone has the opportunity to give input, that there aren't 1 or 2 voices completely dominating the discussion, which is not a very rare thing in group meetings. One way to do this is to ask some open-ended questions rather than yes or no questions. So what do you think about something? How would you recommend we go about doing this? And then wait. And this is the hardest thing for some speakers and some meeting leaders, is just being comfortable with silence. So pause after asking a question. And as the leader, I would also encourage you to avoid sharing your thoughts right away. So to gather the ideas of the group before you put your ideas out there. Often if a leader puts their ideas out there, then the tendency of the group is just to kind of nod in agreement and move on. And so I would just encourage you to wait, let other people give their input, and then you can absolutely give yours. If there are a couple of people who aren't saying much, call on them gently. But who did we say? We said Kim was our ally. So Kim, what do you think about this? You've been quiet. I know you've had some experience with this. What do you have to say about it? If the group's really quiet after you ask questions, it may be that they just need some more time to think before responding. People who tend to be more analytical and want to be careful about how they answer things generally need a little bit more time to gather their thoughts. So if you've got this going on where you throw out a question and there's a lot of silence, one thing you could do is just to throw out that question, ask people to write down their ideas, and then go around the group and ask people to share what they wrote. I wouldn't do this a lot. I wouldn't make this a practice every time there's a question, but if you're just feeling like there's just a lack of engagement in a discussion, this can be something that helps get it going. Sometimes despite our best efforts, we end up with 1 or 2 group members who dominate. And if in a given meeting you're feeling like one person's taking most of the airtime, you can gently redirect by saying things like, thanks for sharing, let's hear what other people have to say. If a tangent comes up which it's rare to be in a meeting that a tangent doesn't come up. We need to allow for some of these, but again, sticking to your agenda. You're within your rights to ask to put that topic in a parking lot. If you haven't used a parking lot before, it's actually a physical place often in a meeting, so it could be a piece of flip chart paper, a corner of a whiteboard, or something else where we record things that the group should be discussing, but just not right now. And those can be captured and incorporated into future agendas. And again, before adjourning, it's really important to revisit the action list to make sure that everyone has the same understanding about who is going to be responsible for what and by when. When you think about being a group leader, this is a principle that a previous boss of mine really liked to live by, and I think about this probably close to once a day. You know, when I'm in the leading a meeting or serving in a leadership role. My former boss worked for a really large corporation. He's very well respected by people at all levels of the organization. He's kind of a master at building relationships. And early in my career, he shared this philosophy with me. This accept less than your share of the credit and more than your share of the blame. It doesn't mean you need to be a doormat and let everyone run over you, but it means that when you're the leader of a team, it's really critical to continually acknowledge the contributions that your fellow team members make. And as a leader, to take responsibility when things don't go as planned. I've seen this philosophy in action, and I can tell you that if you want to build strong relationships and ensure that team members know you have their back, you might want to consider this concept. And it's especially visible during meetings when people are talking about what's been done and what still needs to be done. It's incredibly important to recognize out loud the contributions that others in the group have made or have offered to make. It keeps people, it really sets up the environment to encourage engagement across the board. And after the meeting, the follow-through is really important. Be sure to distribute meeting notes to all stakeholders, including the action items identified during the meeting. This is for the people who were at the meeting and were not at the meeting, again, to keep everybody in the loop and having the same understanding. All right, I'm going to pull up our last question. We're going to get into talking about remote participants. So during what proportion of your stakeholder meetings does at least one person participate remotely? Wow, we're kind of all across the board. So we've got a lot of you that have all of them where someone participates remotely, another bunch that has some. We've got about a fourth of you where none of the meetings have remote participants. Look at that. We're evenly split. Most and some have the same percentage and all and none. All right, so we're all across the board on this. So for those of you who don't have remote participants, consider yourself lucky. You've already got a leg up on engagement. The environment is a little bit more conducive to engagement when everybody's together in person. And if all of them, it doesn't mean you can't do it. It just presents one additional challenge. I'll give you some strategies for doing that. And again, if you've got things that have worked for you, please share them. So because there could be some challenges specific to meetings where one or more participants call in or video conference in, let's just take a couple minutes talking about these challenges and ways that we can minimize some of these challenges. The first point to make is that you'll get better engagement in remote meetings if everyone has met in person before. Sometimes this isn't possible But I always recommend that whenever it's feasible, it's ideal that everyone can be there in person for the first meeting. When people have had the opportunity to at least have been in the same room once and gotten to know each other's faces and made small talk before and after, they automatically feel more connected to the group. That's just how our brain is wired. I know you're all past the point of your first meeting, long past the point, but this is just something for you to keep in mind for the future, or maybe something to think about if new subgroups will be formed as your work continues, or just periodically as you work together. If you can't all be in person, the next best format is a video conference so that you can at least see people's faces. I will warn you that you'll have to explicitly ask people to turn their cameras on because generally when people participate in a video conference, they like to turn their camera off. And then audio conference is sort of your last resort when you talk about initial meetings anyway. Okay, so let's talk about a couple best practices. When you know people will be joining remotely, be sure to send out copies of all materials beforehand again, but not just the agenda, but any slides, any handouts, any other materials you'll be referencing. Be sure that you start on time. Some experts recommend starting